Murders, senseless killing, and horrors were all perpetrated in Nanking. Today's video will give you the history and first-hand account stories behind one of the worst atrocities in the past 100 years. Stay tuned and welcome to Morbid Memoirs. Japan during World War II was known for its brutal treatment of prisoners of war. Comparisons have been drawn up to their allies, the Nazis, with some claiming that this brutality was on par or even worse. Atrocities were committed by the Japanese army with a clear dismissal of the Geneva Convention. A magnitude of mass killings occurred throughout captured territories as they advanced across the Asian continent. In this video, we'll be focused on the Nanking Massacre, with stories that show the severity inflicted not just on soldiers but innocent bystanders. Being one of the worst massacres of all time, the Nanking Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking as it's often referred to, lasted 6 weeks with a total estimated death count of 200,000. We'll be discussing the events leading up to one of the worst massacres in history and focusing on first-hand accounts. Tensions between Japan and China were high going into the 20th century. The First Sino-Japanese War, which happened between July 1894 to April 1895, ended with Japan claiming victory and territory over China. This territory, which was on the northeast coast, would be expanded 40 years later with the Mukden incident of 1931. This incident was devised by Japanese military personnel, causing the invasion of Manchuria, where they were ultimately able to set up a puppet state of Manchukuo. As Japan encroached closer on Chinese land, small local skirmishes broke out between the two. However, it was not until the Marco Polo Bridge incident on the 7th of July 1937 that would escalate the countries into full-blown war. Located 10 miles outside of Beijing, the event occurred outside of a town called Wanping. Colonel Matsui of the Japanese army wished to enter Wanping to search for a missing soldier. General Qin of the Chinese army ordered the local Chinese commander to resist any Japanese attempt to enter the town. By the 8th of July, a tense situation had risen as the Japanese were repulsed from the defences. On the same day, a verbal agreement was agreed for a ceasefire between General Qin and the Japanese High Command. However, even though this was agreed, General Masakazu Kawabe went against his superior's orders and shelled Wanping. Further skirmishes between Chinese communists and Japanese China garrison forces meant that they were heading towards all-out war. This finally occurred on the 9th of August 1937 when a Japanese naval officer was shot in Shanghai. Within 3 months of fighting in Shanghai, the city eventually fell into Japanese hands. Sights were set towards the then capital of China, Nanking, with General Iwan Matsui believing that its capture would force China to surrender. Nanking was the ancient capital of various Chinese dynasties, being elected as the capital of the nationalist government during the Chinese Civil War in 1927. It was known as an important economic hub for transportation and trade, as it was strategically placed next to the Yangtze River. Most of the Chinese High Command believed that defending Nanking was futile, as its defences were weak topographically. The Chinese army had already suffered major losses in Shanghai, which they needed time to recover from. The terrain meant attackers could easily advance on the city, and the Yangtze River cut any chance of retreat. Tang Shengzi stepped up and decided that he would defend the city, leading the garrison forces. Remnants of surviving units of Shanghai and local conscripts were rushed to aid the Nanking garrison force. At the beginning of December 1937, the Japanese forces rushed to Nanking, with the troops travelling an average of 25 miles a day. During this advance, they were only met with small amounts of resistance, with their air supremacy and tanks helping sweep the remainder of the retreating Shanghai forces. By the 9th of December, the fall of Nanking was imminent. With the Japanese army reaching the Zhongshan Gate, only the Fukui line stood as the last line of defence. Shengzi ordered that no soldier was to retreat and must fight to the death, which was reflected in the Chinese pillboxes being chained from the outside to stop fleeing. Roughly 1,000 Chinese soldiers were shot by their own army for attempts to retreat. By the 12th of December, the Chinese army were encircled. Shengzi gave the order for all units to commence breakout, and he escaped across the Yangtze River to the city of Puko. Other units were not as successful, with China's 66th and 83rd Regiment trying to escape through a hole in the Japanese forces, leading them to their own minefield. Chinese soldiers stuck in Nanking discarded their uniforms to blend in with civilians. Countless amounts of weapons, shoes, grenades, helmets and other belongings littered the streets. Once the fighting had ended, the brutality began, not just on the remaining Chinese prisoners of war, but the civilians of Nanking. Within 72 hours of the surrender, a large group of prisoners of war were lined up along the banks of the Yangtze River. These captives were shot without a trial or any pretense. 30,000 prisoners of war would meet their demise in this way, being disposed of in the river, mass graves, or burnt. The Japanese would attempt to identify the Chinese soldiers that were blending in with the civilian refugees. Kenzu Okamoto, a former Japanese soldier, was involved with questioning civilians. They would have to fill out their birth year and month, as well as their occupation. Very few of the Chinese could write or understand what the Japanese soldiers were asking. If they could not answer these questions, then they would be deemed suspicious and taken away. Once deemed suspicious, they would be rounded up and taken to areas such as the Nanking airport. Okamoto stated that among the rounded up were men, women and children, some even under the age of 10. Once led to the airfield, they were bound by ropes and forced to huddle in a group in front of the main hangar. The Japanese soldiers had mounted a light machine gun on top of the hangar and an order was shouted to fire. The soldiers opened fire, mowing down the defenseless victims, some trying to run away but were gunned down by the Japanese who were guarding. For these soldiers it was either us or them, as their mindset saw any potential opponent as threats. At this time 400 to 500 were murdered, with the soldiers taking a full day to clear the countless bodies. They set up rail tracks to put the bodies on, placing firewood underneath. Gasoline was then doused over the bodies of men, women and children, which was then set alight. The bodies would not easily burn, as the organs would cause massive clouds of smoke to be let off. The Japanese soldiers would stir the bodies with big sticks to help in their disposal. This story shows a grim occupation under the Japanese, with innocent lives being taken, with very loose accusations of civilians being enemies. Another Japanese soldier, Yoshira Tagachi, who was a sergeant, was ordered by a superior to round up civilians. Accompanied by 4 first-year soldiers, they detained 5 men who they tied up against a tree. With their bayonets pointed, orders were given to the first-year soldiers to use them on the defenseless Chinese men. Tagachi bayoneted the remaining man, sinking the blade into his chest. Tagachi also recounted that some Japanese soldiers committed atrocities that were far worse than evil. He recalled that one of these atrocities happened when a group of soldiers had taken a pregnant woman captive. They had stripped her naked and used a fixed bayonet to stab her bulging stomach. They then proceeded to spread her legs, tying each leg up to a tree and inserting a live grenade into her womb. The soldiers stood by as the Chinese woman screamed in agonizing pain until the explosion of the grenade went off and all was silent. This shows the clear brutality of the Japanese soldiers and the vile acts that were perpetrated in Nanking. Years later, when Tagachi was arrested as a prisoner of war, he saw a picture of the man who he had bayoneted so long ago in Nanking. He was alive and well, and this brought him to tears. Another well-documented story from Nanking was the 100-man killing contest between 2 sub-lieutenants of the Japanese army, shown in a Japanese newspaper, the Tokyo Nishi Shimbun. Toshiaki Muka and Takeshi Noda, both from the Katagiri unit at Kayong, were said to have engaged in who could be the first to slay 100 Chinese with their swords before the full occupation of Nanking. The newspaper stated that by the time they had reached Chungshanling, Mukai had 107 and Noda had 105 kills each their name, respectively. Neither of them could tell who had reached 100 first, so extended this goal, setting a new goal of 150. Noda was said to be fearless, shouting his names lest the enemy mistake it, plunging himself towards a pillbox and cutting down 4 men. Mukai was said to have dented his Seki no Mogaraku, his blade, when he sliced a Chinese soldier in half down the middle, including his steel helmet. He vowed that he would donate the sword to the Tokyo Nishi Shimbun once the war had ended. This story has been contested in recent years due to its lack of solid evidence apart from the paper's account. If this killing contest did take place, most of these lives that were taken would have most likely been defenseless captured soldiers. Even some civilians may have ended up as victims. When the war had ended, they were arrested by the Tokyo War Crime Tribunal and held at Sugamo prison. However, the Nanking Military Tribunal extradited both Mukai and Oda, standing them on trial for the murders. They were classed as B+C war criminals and executed as they could not provide enough persuasive counter-evidence. The huge loss of life at Nanking has not been talked about enough in history. Rape and murders were committed over a 6-week period. The burial society counted more than 155,000 bodies buried, with most of them having their hands bound. This does not even include bodies that were disposed of in the Yangtze River or various other means. A third of the city was destroyed by burning. Majority of this came from either Japanese soldiers deliberately setting fires or negligently leaving them to develop. The Nanking massacre shows a complete disregard for life that the Japanese army had. This would be one of the many atrocities that were carried out until the end of the war in 1945. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, consider subscribing below and click the like button. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.